have to find where we. All right, so one more time, I'm going to put the link to our Google Doc agenda inside the Zoom chat. So you can feel free to follow along on there with what's going on today. You can, if you'd like, add your name so people know that you are here. And then there's also sort of a discussion area. So if you've got questions throughout, I'm going to start with some presentations. If you've got questions about those, please add them. If you've got some discussion topics you want to bring up, please add them. And we will kind of do our best to pick the topics that people find the most interesting. And then we'll have some time to sort of just have a free-form discussion about those. Last year when we did this, we kind of carefully came up with a list of topics we thought would be interesting. And the discussion went completely off the rails. We didn't even follow the agenda. So this year, it's a little bit less strict. I think people will have their own things they find interesting, either with respect to the presentations we're about to do or something else that's just been on their mind for a while. So I actually have some slides that I can start with. So I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, first of all, hi, I'm Charlie Hoyt. I'm a research fellow at the Laboratory of Systems Pharmacology in Harvard Medical School in Boston. However, I'm working remote from Germany, which is why it's dark right now for me. I've been working on chemistry and then biology and then computer science side of life sciences in the last 10 years or so. And I found myself thinking a lot about prefixes, curies, and IRIs in the last couple of years. And so, like I said, that this is kind of like a follow-up workshop. We actually did something similar to this last year. And so, yeah, we've got this agenda. I hope everyone got a chance to like jot that down or open it up. That agenda is a link, a nexus to all the presentations that people are going to give if they want to publicly share them. At least the ones that we've put together are on here. And yeah, so the goals of like the 90 minutes we've carved out this morning is to sort of reflect on things that have changed or progress that's been made since last year's discussion. It's actually a link to last year's discussion in this Google Doc as well, if you want to try and dig up some of these old ideas. This is a place where people can showcase their new tools, their workflows, some philosophies, what they've been thinking about with respect to how prefixes, curies, and IRIs are useful in sort of the life sciences and the tangential sort of semantic web things. And again, this is an opportunity for us as a small community to describe some of the things that we're working on, some of the problems we're having, like what tools we wish we had, and other kind of various pain points. And this is a good place to do this because there's a lot of developers in the room. There's a lot of users in the room. Many of us are both developers and users of the tools that deal with these things. And we care about the results of these in our more science and sort of method focused workflows. So like I said, one more time, here's the link. If you want to have some collaborative note taking, that would be great. If you want to add some additional ideas for discussion, please do that. Before we begin, I think we should go through some vocabulary because there's a lot of different words that talk about the stuff that we're talking about today. I've managed to omit curie and URI. I think everybody knows what curies and URIs are, but if you don't, then I'll come back to that one more time. I've had this problem recently where I want to talk about resources that mint local unique identifiers. And so like a lot of ontologies do this, several databases do this. There's even other kinds of resources that are neither of those that do this. So we're going to call these identifier resources. These are things that assign stable, unique identifiers. Like, okay, here's a concrete example is Kibi assigns unique identifiers to chemicals. And so we also have to be careful using the word identifier while we're talking today for the next 90 minutes, because identifier can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it means a globally unique identifier. Sometimes it means a locally unique identifier. So let's be very specific. And let's say local unique identifier when we're talking about things like entries within identifier resources. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4 could be a local unique identifier within the disease ontology. This refers to a term called gender incongruence. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4 is also a PubMed identifier. And so within the PubMed identifier resource, this refers to a paper called The Change in Kinetics of Sulfacetamide Tissue Distribution in Walker Tumor-Bearing Rats. Okay, wow, that's interesting. So there's locally unique identifiers. There's also this idea of like globally unique identifiers, which people are typically using like URIs or IRIs to be globally unique. Okay, so then there's the idea of prefixes. Now, prefix can actually mean a lot of things. So we're going to be even more specific. We're going to talk about curie prefixes. These are short mnemonics that are usually used for identifier resources. And this is like a very natural thing. Like Kibi is the prefix that we use to talk about Kibi. And DO is, or DOID is typically the prefix we use to refer to disease ontology and PubMed. is usually the prefix used for PubMed. So a lot of times this is like using the initialism or the acronym for a resource. Prefixes, actually each identifier resource can have many potential different prefixes. And so this is a little bit of a problem. This is definitely a pain point in our community. And why do people care about these prefixes? Well, they're usually used in semantic web applications and prefix maps to shorten URIs. And so the other hand to a query prefix is a URI prefix. And this is the part at the beginning of a URI or an IRI. Now, forgive me, I'm going to use URI, IRI, and probably even sometimes URL interchangeably. There's some differences between them. There's like some minutia, but for most of the applications we're doing, they can almost be considered the same. So I'll just try and use URI to mean all of these things. I know there's a little bit of difference, but let's kind of gloss over that. So the beginning part of all the different URIs within an identifier resource that refer to all of the local unique identifiers in it, the beginning part is the URI prefix. So like if you've got a URI describing a key B identifier, all of them start with this same part. If I click on this, it actually doesn't go to anything. It's not really a useful URL. And it's also the case that URI prefixes aren't necessarily unique for each identifier resource. There could be many different URI prefixes that can be stuck in front of a local unique identifier to create a valid URI that describes this thing. So this is a little bit of a problem we've been having as well. Okay, next one is prefix maps. And this is a mapping from query prefixes to URI prefixes. So these seem to go together like pretty naturally. Typically, these are bijective. However, that's not a requirement, especially because we know that neither query prefixes nor URI prefixes are necessarily unique for a given identifier resource. Okay, let me double check the chat. There's already a couple of people saying things.
Yeah, Chris was just pointing out that there's a slight difference in the usage in your vocabulary and some of the other communities is how they are using it.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't really find that as problematic as your sort of like glossing over the differences between URL and IRI type identifiers, but maybe we will go over this a bit later when some of the talks have been given.
Yeah, for sure. This all reflects, like what are the different motivations of different kinds of people who are in this. Like for me, these aren't super important differences. However, for other people, this matters a lot. It depends kind of what your practical use is. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, let's keep these notes going. And then let me try and finish up so we can already get to what people want to say about the stuff. Thank you, Nico. Okay, so I ended on prefix map. And then there's this idea of a provider. This is just like some resource, like a web service that takes this local unique identifier from some identifier resource and gives back a web response, like a web page. Sometimes these give back things like structured data. So maybe that can both be part of a provider. And then there's also this idea of a meta resolver, which is some kind of like next level version of a provider, which takes arbitrary queries and can redirect them to different providers. Okay, maybe the last term, which kind of doesn't fit with all of these, is the idea of a drive-by curation. But I think this is important within the scope of like talking about maintainable resources. So drive-by curation is when someone who uses a resource, they find like a typo or some small thing that they need fixed. And then they go ahead and they just make a tiny little submission, like either via an issue tracker, or they make a pull request on like a Git repository, fixing the issue. And like, that's it. They're not a maintainer of the resource. They're not really a massive contributor. They just kind of saw it and they fixed it. So I think this idea of drive-by curation is quite important. And we'll talk about that later. Okay. I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about the bioregistry today, but I want to give a brief state of the bioregistry, and then we can kind of let people talk about this tool if they want to more. Otherwise, we might be talking about other things today. So since last year, there's a lot of new content, a lot of new tooling and better automation in the bioregistry. So it's covering more prefixes, more synonyms are inside it. It's covering and aligning to more external registries like identifiers.org, Obo Foundry, and even like there's other different kinds of resources, which a lot of them have different like focuses and different scopes, but still they're all curating interesting metadata about identifier resources. And so this is why it's worth aligning to some of them, even if they're not doing the same thing the bioregistry is doing. So last year's workshop, we talked about, the need for governance and code of conduct and improving the longevity of these resources. And we really focused on that in the last year to sort of make it possible for different people to make contributions, make it sort of decentralized from a given institution, from a given set of physical and infrastructure where it's deployed. We've thought a lot about what is it going to cost to maintain this over time, both from a deployment standpoint, which isn't so big. And then what was it going to cost to like keep up with making improvements? And hopefully the idea of the drive-by curation can kind of minimize that cost, because we want to enable people to do that for most of the time. Yeah, and then another like big announcement is that we submitted a paper on the bioregistry, which we opened this up to everybody who had made contributions to the bioregistry, whether they're like part of discussions or whether they were code contributors or content contributors, and we opened that up for everybody who wanted to join. And yeah, we were successful at sort of going through review and getting published in Nature Scientific Data. So this actually came out like about a week ago, and this is quite a nice accomplishment for this community. For everyone who like didn't get the chance to be involved in that, please don't be discouraged. We'll probably publish on this again in the future, and we'll still keep the same policy of anyone who helps gets to be a contributor. Okay, so yeah, I mean, here's some of the numbers. There's like quite a bit of cool things. There's prefixes, there's synonyms for these prefixes, there's external registries and metadata about them. There's also this idea of cross-registry mappings. So like, what's the same prefix annotated by bioregistry? What's that called inside Obo Foundry? What's that called in identifiers.org? And each of these other 25 registries when available. There's also this idea of mismatches. So we can help like make explicit when are the times when things, they look the same, but they're not representing the same thing. Maybe a classic example of this is gene expression omnibus and geographical entity ontology. Both share the prefix GEO in various resources, and depending on like why they were curated, there's some clash. And so this is kind of how we're dealing with those clashes. And yeah, until now, there's actually 42 people who have made contributions in terms of the content and making little improvements to bioregistry. So this is quite a big number. I'm very happy with this. So thank you everybody so far who's made contributions. I'm going to gloss over this again too. So like here's kind of a quick look at how good the bioregistry covers and maps to all these other different resources. You can see things like Obo Foundry, name the thing, identifiers.org, they get completely mapped. There's other things kind of further down the list that are a little bit more tricky to map. Some resources don't really have a lot of information available that makes it hard to automate mapping. So you'd have to do this manually. And sometimes so for example, EDAM ontology has ontology terms representing identifiers from different resources. And so this is a natural map to prefixes in the bioregistry, though there's not a lot of information on what each of these things are. So some of them are very cryptic. Maybe you could say the same about each of these. If people have specific questions, we can come back to this. Here's kind of the same view again, but here's the real question we wanted to answer with this is like, how frequently do each prefix appear in each resource? So the one that appears in the most resources is the NCBI taxonomy. Like this is really, really common. Everybody's got a name for this and everyone's using it. Also really, really common are, I think, gene ontology and Kibi. For people who are building these kind of resources, these are just like really typical ontologies. For the most part though, different identifier resources are not frequently covered by every different registry. So this is interesting. And then like this other thing I said is because NCBI taxonomy is so prevalent, it turns out a lot of people have different names for NCBI taxonomy. They use different curie prefixes or something akin to what a curie prefix should be inside their resource. And sometimes these are ambiguous, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're sort of these mnemonics, sometimes they're not, like in Wikidata and fair sharing, they're these more sort of opaque identifiers. And this kind of has all sorts of other tangential issues. So we may get into discussion about this by the end of the day. So thank you for letting me ramble for a little bit about that. And so I want to give our agenda for today. So we're already, I think, a couple of minutes behind, but we started a little late. So this is probably fine. So we've got a little bit of overview. We just finished. We're going to do a show and tell for the next 30 minutes or so. This is a chance for people to present some of the things that they're doing. And then we're just going to have kind of a discussion. This can kind of go however you all want it to go. And maybe we don't even need 5 minutes for closing remarks. So yeah, thank you for kind of indulging me for a moment. And it's probably a good time to let the first person give their show and tell. So I think Sierra's first on the list. Are you happy to go first, Sierra?
Sure, sounds great. Share my screen. Everybody can see my slides. Okay, so I think everybody knows me, which means that I won't be so nervous giving this talk. And you can also remember that you can interrupt me anytime. If I say something wrong or say something incongruent or whatever, please feel free to interrupt me. But for those of you that don't know me, I'm a developer in Chris's group at LBNL. I sort of work primarily on reconciling and data wrangling for a variety of different biological projects, including the GO, a variety of different knowledge graphs, the Monarch Initiative, and the NCATS data translator. But in this talk, I'll sort of be wearing the hat of a developer using the tools we're talking about today. sort of including bioregistry, prefix maps, a new tool that Chris and some others in our group wrote, and how these projects make use of prefixes in the context of the BioLink model, which is our core data model that Deepak, who's on here, worked on as well, Chris, everyone else, and how it depends on proper Curie prefix expansion to help us unify data across, more than 300 data sources in a really federated data ecosystem. So before we get into that, we should probably identify the pain points in data harmonization that BioLink model in particular helps ease, and how it depends on stable prefix expansions. I know we're all here already aware of the pain points in data wrangling in general. We wish that data came in neat packages that we could reuse with ease, but instead it often comes in a variety of different serializations, RDF, Neo4j, SQL. It uses different words to talk about the same concept, like is a data source conflating between a transcript ID and its associated expression, or a gene ID and its associated expression, a reference protein ID versus a gene used as the identifier for a particular association. And importantly for the work that we're doing in this workshop, with these differences above come different ID nomenclatures. Some data sources might try to reuse an existing identifier, some might mint their own, and Charlie sort of hit on this. And with these, they do this with various degrees of formalism and best practices for minting identifiers. Some data sources use IRIs, some uses CURIEs. And in order for us to interoperate between these data sources downstream, we need to have a rigorous and unchanging mapping between resources themselves, as well as the mappings between their identifier forms. So IRI versus Curie is critical to us. So BioLink helps bridge the divide here a bit with a few different meta-model constructs provided by LinkML. So we can rely on the work of many ontologists and semantic engineers for the definitions in BioLink. So on the left, you can see that we provide exact mappings here to a variety of different ontologies. We can also use this meta-model component of ID prefixes as sort of like documentation, but that helps data ingesters who are using BioLink model apply the data in external sources to the appropriate BioLink categories. And we've even had tools developed on top of BioLink model that use these ID prefixes to help normalize identifiers across different data sources. So in the data translator project, there's a tool called the node normalizer, which uses BioLink mappings and the ID prefixes. Remember, this is like I should note that this is an ordered prefix list of preferred identifiers for this particular class. So it uses these different mappings and ID prefixes to translate between different namespaces. So you could submit to this tool an HGNC identifier and get back the NCBI gene identifier, for example. But BioLink can also make use and many serializations of the model based on the community it serves. So via LinkML, which is the underlying meta-model framework. I'm not sure if I said that already, but I'm sure a lot of you know about LinkML already. So BioLink itself can be serialized as RDF. And in RDF serialization, the expansion of a prefix doesn't just serve humans looking at a web page, it formalizes the resource's unique identifier. So for example, if we were to change HTTP in an IRI for identifiers.org to HTTPS, that means changing the identifier for all the resources that use that expansion. And if you think about it in database formalizations, if you were to change the primary key in your database, you would be screwed, right? Like a primary key for a table could have enormous downstream applications or implications. So in addition, like as web pages evolve, so do the human readable locations or URLs for those sources. And in BioLink and in identifiers.org and bioregistry, we really want to mask these changes with a stable identifier that will not change even as the web pages evolve. So BioLink cares very much about the mapping from a short form prefix to the semantic namespace for a resource. But we only want to curate prefixes and their expansions in one location. It's very nice to have an arbitrator to minimize ID minting in different forms and syntaxes. Charlie and the bioregistry group are essential here to help us make the right kinds of prefix expansions for identifiers. We also want to reduce redundant effort. So sometimes in my workflow, I'll need to add a new resource prefix expansion. I'm sorry, I'm going over just a few more points. I might make that expansion in bioregistry to identify a new prefix. I then go and I try to retrieve that prefix expansion from my upstream sources, either prefix commons or identifiers.org or bioregistry, and I find that the expansion is not correct, so then I need to curate in BioLink model as well. So we really want this to work. A library that we put in place to help with that allows you to sort of like order the prefix space that you want and that you need for your particular downstream application. That library is called Prefix Maps, and I'm currently using it in BioLink model to take the prefixes in bioregistry, map them through my preferred expansion set, including OBO as my preferred expansion first, and then put it into BioLink model so that I can kind of keep that consistent as we go. And I can talk about more of this as we go, but I've already gone over by 2 minutes, so I should probably stop here. Oh, I didn't check the chat. Please just interrupt me. That's it.
Sierra. Great. Yeah, let's try and keep questions to the end, and let's keep going just so we can keep our eye on the time. I think all the discussion that we want to have on this, we can put into this Google Doc, and then we can bring it back up. So next we've got Sanya Batha Taneja. I don't know if it's a hard J. Sorry if I pronounced
it is.
Okay. And we're having her join us from a very, very new member to the kind of group that's here already. So you can introduce yourself and let us know what you're up to.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen first.
Looks good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sanya. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm very excited to be able to attend the workshop this year. My super short lightning talk is about how I use the bioregistry in my knowledge graph assembly process. And very briefly, the use case for this project was integrating an ontology-based knowledge graph and a literature-based graph to construct a knowledge graph for, excuse me, hypothesis generation, which is called NPKG. NP stands for natural products. The ontology-based graph comes from Tiffany Callahan's fantastic phenolator workflow. You should check that out if you haven't already. And the literature-based graph is actually constructed from 2 different machine reading systems. One is SEMREP, which was developed by NLM, and the other Indra system developed by the Indra lab at Harvard Medical School. So as a part of this knowledge graph construction, all concepts from the different data sources were needed to be mapped to OBO identifiers, and just because that was the preference I had for this, to be able to fully integrate these 2 graphs with the potential to search through the knowledge graph later and then generate hypotheses that would be supported by both the ontology-based graph and the literature. However, as those of you who work in knowledge graph construction and named entity recognition and mappings might know, the process is not as perfect as much as you try to make it be. Additionally, when a lot of data sources are integrated and there are multiple tools and methods being used for the mappings, there are bound to be errors. So shortly after the construction and integration was complete and I was moving on to the hypothesis generation side, I realized that the prefixes in the knowledge graph that I'd constructed were not all aligned. And this is how, examples of how they looked. You can immediately see some problems. So for example, UMLS should not have had the OBO prefix. There are a lot of these prefix expansions, I think we're calling them, that snuck in that I was not expecting. And while both the phenolator workflow and the machine reading systems perform entity normalization and verification at their individual levels, in this case, I think the integration and use of these different tools led to some of these problems. And so with bioregistry, I was able to map all the prefixes to CURIEs and create a knowledge graph that was based, that essentially had verified and correct CURIEs for all the different entity types. And this was helpful on multiple levels, the simplest being that I don't have to keep track of the different entities that are in there. And then also down the line when the knowledge graph is being used for other applications with embeddings and link prediction and so on. Lastly, I think that there's a potential to utilize the bioregistry much earlier in the knowledge graph assembly process, which I did not do for this, rather than waiting for the last step to normalize all of it when we identify the errors. That's all I have, but I'm happy to discuss and answer any questions later. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's kind of move on, and anyone who's got comments on that, just go ahead and put them in the Google Doc. The next person on the list is Sebastian, and he's got a live demo to give. So I'll let you introduce yourself and what you're up to.
Thanks. I'm not sure it's so much a live demo. It's more of a more convenient way of showing you code as compared to having it to paste it into some slide. So first, as a means of introduction, I am Sebastian. I work in the lab of Julio Zayas Rodriguez in the University Hospital of Heidelberg in Germany. And I'm kind of new to this ontology scene. Thanks again, Charlie, for inviting me. I did my PhD in a more classical pharmacological lab, and now I've been working on knowledge representation for about a year. And we have the same problems that my preceding speakers have already visualized, and which most of you probably know, that we want to build specific representations for the specific tasks that we have. And in the migration of our own database, which is called OmniPath, we had the idea to abstract this process and make it a bit easier for the people that are not too into the technicalities of ontology, which is what we call biocipher at the moment. And this builds knowledge graphs from a variety of prior knowledge adapters, as we call them. So these individual sources of knowledge that we have, no matter where they may be, and then tries to harmonize them through mapping on ontology. And here we profit a lot from the great work that you're doing with BioLink, for example, or with the bioregistry project, which is probably why Charlie asked me to briefly present. And it's not really important what biocipher does in detail. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to get this zoom bar out of the way because it keeps reappearing. It's basically a process that you should be able to, in a very low code manner, create a knowledge graph from any kind of source. And here is just an example where we could use UniProt, and then you have a couple of fields that the API gives you, and you only need a few lines of code to then get your knowledge representation, for example, in a property graph or in an RDF. And so we met, Charlie and me met, because I mentioned that I wanted to go from this very explicit to a more implicit form of representing the input types, and that bioregistry is very useful for that because it can pass the identifiers and check whether something that says that it is a protein actually is a protein. And we kind of developed this basic example of a metaprogramming class, which would create subclasses at runtime, because if someone uses biocipher in a very simple configurable manner, and then we have a file which details the entities that they want to have in the graph, we're only aware of these at runtime, basically. So it would go through these prefixes that it finds in the configuration at runtime, and for each of them create a new class that then has the validation methods, for example, the passing from bioregistry inside for each of these resources automatically. So if you run this, you see that it takes from bioregistry the names of the prefix classes that you put in here. And there's also the case that the Go ontology appears to not have a name. I don't know if that's on purpose, but that's what we see here. And that's basically it. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussions later.
Great. Thank you, Sebastian. The next person on the list is Ian, and I'm not sure if I saw him on the line yet. He mentioned that he might have some slides, but we just talked about this earlier. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. It's the screen. Let me just find the slides. So far, untitled and unformatted, because I put it together very quickly. So just a couple of points, really, that I wanted to pick up on here. The first one is to do with security and the security questions on Curie resolution. you know, I mean, so who am I, by the way? I'm at NIH. I'm have been for some time part of the National Cancer Institute, but at the moment I'm on detail at NCBI. So the security question has come up before, and we explored this first a couple of years ago, actually, in relation to the use of CURIEs in the GA4GH Data Repository Service, or DERS, which is a service intended to provide cloud agnostic access to objects in the cloud, heavily sequences, but also other kinds of objects like images as well are showing up as DERS IDs. At the time, we discussed this with identifiers.org and N2T. There was quite a nice discussion about that, which I've linked to. You know, I think from the GA4GH point of view, I think everyone was reassured that the risks were manageable. And maybe they are, maybe that's all it takes. But I think, you know, it seems to me that we need to address the security issue. If it is well covered, I think we need to document that and to make it clear about how configuring this in a secure way can be done, for example, through trusted resolvers that are maintained locally. For example, if you go to that document, you'll find out what various of the strategies that were discussed were. Yeah, and maybe this is really just about documenting how to do all this, but I think maybe some of these questions need revisiting. You know, the immediate urgency for us is that we're putting up a DERS server at NCBI, or it is actually up, and we need to future-proof it. And one of the things is that the host that it's on is likely to change from the two URLs here. And so prefixing is going to give us an isolation from having to deal with the kind of thing that we have to deal with internally with, you know, provisioning servers, load balancing, various internal things you really don't want to know about, but I'm sure you have your own version of. Just as a highlight, this is to show the use of DERS, of CURIEs within DERS. These are all prefixes that have been registered, and most of them resolved by a registry. All of them resolved through identifiers.org, which is where they've been registered. And yeah, there are petabytes and petabytes of data available through these. So it's kind of worked pretty well. All of this prefixing has been done through implementations through Bob Grossman's setup at the University of Chicago. So I'm going to make sure they get, because really this is their work that dealt with adopting this and making these data available through that route. That's the slide. That's the colorful version of what's really on the previous slide. It raises a question because a number of people have already referenced prefixing for NCBI resources. And Charlie, this is the page that I found in Bioregistry about NCBI prefixes, but I'm still trying to connect at this end how NCBI prefixes are handled. You know, one of the things I'm encountering is on this DERS service, so maybe pushback around the security issues. But and that's the big thing here, is the security issue and making sure that's handled. The other point, and it's probably relatively minor, this is mainly, I think, probably about just needing help with Bioregistry. But though I'd highlight, you know, what some of the use cases are for running a local meta resolver. The security one we touched on, but maybe we need custom resolution. Maybe we need one for development and testing purposes. So here in dbGaP, you can currently resolve a dbGaP ID for the study, which is the PHS number. But there are tables and variables. There are other identifiers and objects within dbGaP that might need referencing, and we'd kind of like to experiment with that. Yeah, so we can show what and so running a local server is useful for that. Yeah, I mean, the main issue I encountered, and as I said, this may just be needing some help with it, as to how we extend for local use rather than caching the whole database. Anyway, those were the 2 points, one big one relatively minor.
That's great. Thank you, Ian. For sure, there's an interesting discussion about security, which maybe a lot of us haven't considered yet. And then some of these things definitely have solutions already. So we'll chat about those at the end. But for sake of consistency, let's follow through with the rest of our show and tells, and then we can come back to discussions. Okay, so because we're a little bit behind time, I had an extra thing that we're going to skip probably. So I'd like to invite Tiffany Callahan and Megan Balk to present on the bioregistry review team and its governance structure. I think I'm supposed to be responsible for the slides though.
Or I can if that's too much. Your call.
I got it. Here we go.
Awesome. So should I just say next slide?
I think maybe why don't you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hi, I am Tiffany Callahan, one of the 4 current core members of the bioregistry review team, here to present to you a little bit about what we've been up to in the last year in terms of trying to help create and maintain the bioregistry and the services associated with it. So I'll be splitting our lightning talk today with Megan. She'll do the second half. Next slide, please. So you probably don't need us to reiterate this to you, but we do like to impress upon, because it is the importance of why we are all here in terms of why we need governance, both for the use of identifiers, URIs, URLs, and other resources within this domain, but also with respect to the bioregistry. So as we're all aware of, many biomedical resources construct different identifiers locally that all reference the same thing. This can cause all kinds of fun problems from an engineering perspective, but also just from trying to use these data sources together in an efficient way. And it's not always clear when you're using these resources what you do when you find an error or inconsistency and how you fix it. So these are some of the many motivations for why we wanted to create and maintain this resource. And the ultimate goal being to enable community-driven curation and maintenance of different registry prefixes and the metadata that's associated with them. Next slide, please. And so the overarching goal, again, provide a technical platform to help solve some of these inconsistencies, make it easier to interact with, maintain, and include new additional prefixes. But to do this, it takes people and effort and time. And we are continuing to evolve a governance document that can help support the social side of the project maintenance. So what does that mean? It means doing things like defining a code of conduct to help developers, maintainers, and just the general community who want to use this resource know expectations about how they should act. To help us find ways to delegate authority and responsibility over how we maintain the registry, how we diffuse conflict, how we maintain updated identifiers and associated data, and also how we ensure that once we've built this great resource, how do we make sure it keeps going and not on the back of just one person, but on the backs of the community. And by that, we want to empower contributions from all different levels of experience, technical abilities, and to improve our curation guidelines overall as we go. We want this to be respectful and objective and have everybody get what they need in a productive way, and to ultimately have this establish trust in the process. Next slide, please. And so what does it look like in terms of day-to-day responsibilities for being on the review team? There's 4 large goals or things that we maintain. So we want to participate in public discussions. Primarily, this takes place through the issue tracker, but also through Slack. We review and merge new prefix requests, which you'll hear a little bit more about next from Megan, and other changes to the content of the bioregistry. We maintain contribution guidelines and requirements, and also the governance document that I mentioned prior. And then always our goal is to facilitate continued improvement to both the data model and the content within the bioregistry. And now I will hand over to Megan.
Great. Yeah, so next slide. So my name is Megan, for those that don't know me. I'm more of a user than I am a programmer or developer. Kind of hang out in more of the bio-database domains than in the ontology world. So I'm going to talk about how you use the bioregistry and interact with it. So the first thing I should say is what's really nice is a lot of this is automated, kind of similar to maybe some other ontology issue trackers or issues that you may use. There's a whole list of options that you can do when you click on issue. The one that we're going to talk about is requesting a new prefix. And then you can fill out the form, which has examples of how to fill it out, as well as provides a space to give your attribution in form of an ORCID. Then you'll submit a pull request, or when you submit the issue, it automatically creates a pull request, which is really nice. And that is what the bioregistry team will review. As kind of some best practices, the bioregistry review team doesn't review their own requests, so we try to get other people to review it. Once the updates are accepted, there's a continuous integration process that's approved by the bioregistry review team, and then also CI does nightly updates, and that's kind of the automated one, it's not manual. And then we have, if you click on the PowerPoint or the slide deck and click on this slide, we have links to our policies for how prefixes must be formed and different guidelines. Next slide. One thing that's very important, especially in building community trust and collaboration when we don't all live near each other, work near each other, is to acknowledge one another early and often. There's a link here for how contributions are summarized, and it shows for each user how many prefixes perhaps they've made, how many they've helped on, authorship on all the manuscripts. So that is open to the development and review team and anyone who's been contributing to the underlying bioregistry. And it's open for that core team to propose other co-authors as well. So a very open model. And then other contributions like institutional or funding are on different sections of the GitHub repository. And there's also an acknowledgements page in the bioregistry. And if you ever see something wrong, you can always make an issue to let us know. Next slide. And then this is currently the review team. Myself, Tiffany, who you met, Charles, and then I can never pronounce his name, who couldn't make it today, I don't think.
Thiago said that there's a combination of massive flooding and also World Cup issues causing him to be unable to attend. Not really sure how you want to read into that.
Yeah. So I think that's it for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, maybe I can tack on one thing about the review team is like, I think it's really important that this is diffused across lots of different institutions, different kinds of people with different backgrounds. I think this is one of the issues that the other registries that are similar had a problem with because of being so centralized. When funding ran out, like it became a big problem for sustainability and like other similar tools. Okay, and Nico has a really excellent question, which we're going to have to talk about later in the chat as well. So yeah, we're done with, I'm not going to give my little presentation because I think we're already a little bit over time, but if anybody's interested in future plans for like curating every prefix possible ever, then we can talk about that. Yeah, so maybe we can go directly back to the Google Doc and have some discussions. So I know that the points that Ian brought up, I think these would be really good to chat about. Nico had a couple questions in the chat. I think also Chris and Sierra. So yeah, I think we can open this up. Please don't let me like dominate the conversation. I just try and moderate. And yeah, anyone who wants to bring some things up, please go ahead and let's chat.
I guess I can, before we go through your excellent list of curated discussion topics, I want to emphasize that for our community, which base basically most of their kind of tech stacks around RDF, for us, what you call like URI expansion is actually the important part. So I just want to make sure that it's accurately reflected in the kind of priorities of bioregistry, that while for you the CURIEs and prefix management is the key bit, for us is really also about like standardizing what we would refer to as IRI expansions. What is really the important thing? We deal with like this kind of massive avalanche of like ontologies downloaded from BioPortal using some strange BioPortal IRIs, and then having, let's say, for example, a ICD-10 BioPortal edition, then downloading it from another source, which uses again a different IRI syntax, and again from another source. So we have this problem. We all the time that we want to combine stuff from these different resources, but you know, what we do is we build like URI, we build these kind of maps to first get all of these different things mapped to, let's say, one semantic space, and then use that one semantic space, pick the preferred prefix for that semantic space, and then define internally in our ETL pipeline, we want to use this one standard representation in RDF for, let's say, ICD-10-CM or something like that. I just want to make sure that it's clear that this is hugely important for us as a community to manage this part.
Nico, do you think you can, as a follow-up to your own point, can you describe a little bit this pipeline that we put together in bioregistry for creating various contexts? You know, we've got like this oboe context, and I think that this is potentially a solution to a lot of similar issues to what you described. So you and I did that together, but it'd be great to hear in your words, like what this is and how it partially solves the problem you just described.
Yeah, let's give just because Michel had this hand up, I think he wanted to say something about this part. Maybe give him a chance, and then I will describe this feature as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this is it's great to have this this workshop, and also I really appreciate the efforts that have been put into bioregistry. I think it's definitely on the right track, and certainly as a community resource is quite crucial. That is the case for our building of Bio2RDF and now subsequent effort called Bio2KG. I want to emphasize what Nico said, which is really like we curated our own registry primarily a long time ago, like, you know, back in 2008, primarily to reconcile the various names that people used in their data files as we parsed them and converted them to RDF. And then, so that was the first thing, was just like, yeah, mapping all these prefixes to at least a canonical one that we would express in our knowledge graph. But also, secondly, is the IRI based, and certainly with the advent of the OWL ontologies, certainly if you process the ones that are in BioPortal, you can see just how diverse and the different IRIs that people use for different ontology terms, it's quite prevalent. And in order for us to make sense of that, we basically have to rewrite the IRIs that are used in various ontologies to a canonical one so that we can query and navigate across these resources. So in our registry, indeed, we had both, you know, both the synonyms for the short names that are used to demark the source of an identifier, but also the IRI templates. And that's not just like, there's also IRIs in the sense of the sort of like a proper identifier for the resource, and then the URLs that people resolve those entries with on the database. So you have both of these, and those changed with time, and they're embedded in different RDF documents. So both of those are the sort of the main use cases for why we were curating that. And I just want to talk a little bit about how like a bit about the profiles. And I think this issue came up when we were negotiating with identifiers.org to merge. We basically wanted to use identifiers.org as the main registry for prefixes. And one of the things that they didn't like was that many of the entries that we had are no longer in business, but we still see them in the data. So it's important for us to be able to recognize ancient or obsoleted prefixes and IRIs and keep track of them so we can understand what they're about. And ultimately to be able to also recognize that different communities use different prefixes, right? So again, like the oboe community might use capitalized prefixes, and in Bio2RDF we used lowercase prefixes just for consistency of the typing and to reduce error in entry. So to me, when we were thinking about, you know, sort of a new registry, we also recognized the need to identify what is the preferred prefix for which community, and to be able to curate that either from a regular expression point of view or on a manual resource by resource aspect. So I think this is really important to support the broad interoperability argument and to satisfy the quirky requirements that different communities might have about the data resource representation in their identifiers.
It looks like Nico's going to screen share something with us.
Yeah, so basically a part, like it's not 100% covering everything, Michelle, that you've said. And I made a comment already in the chat that actually there may be a time where we have to consider that the current meta model in bioregistry actually doesn't, you know, misses this piece of like building like a stable identifier for like a, let's say your IRI expansion, which may not even be intended for URI lookups or some lookup in a particular registry or something like that from these URL expansions. So we don't have that distinction at the moment. But one thing that we did implement, or Charlie did implement, is this kind of idea of community dependent contexts. This concept is not 100% finished developed, but the idea is that you get like a platform that allows you to disagree basically with certain preferences inside of bioregistry. So you can say, for example, okay, bioregistry curates, let's say, these and that external prefix registries. I want to always prefer OboFoundry and then over the bioregistry default, and then biocontext, and then Miriam, and then, or less, let's say, as an order. This is definitely not the exact order that I want for Obo, but just as a point of making the point that you have like an order, and you start first looking here, and then you go to the next, to the next, to the next, to get to let's say a standard map. But then you can also decide that, yeah, while bioregistry has its preference for certain prefixes, actually in my community, we don't really like that to use DOI as a lowercase prefix. We want to use an uppercase prefix, so we remap the prefixes in this kind of context. And then we can even go further than that and say, okay, in my community, there are actually cases where we want to go to a completely different URI expansion, and we can actually customize this entirely. So this is not perfect, and we need to think about how this will work. But in general, I think something like that, a customization approach, would be good for dealing with these kind of like community dependent needs, let's say, that cannot be covered by one single agreed upon resource.
Yeah, maybe I can jump on that. I think this also addresses one of the points that Sierra was talking about, where we're inside the prefix maps package. There's some manual curation, and this is one potential place that manual curation can live, and has the benefit that there's all these automatic artifacts that get generated based on these contexts. So it creates a bijective prefix map. It creates this JSON LD version of this. It creates a shackle version of this. You can get a lot of things for free. Maybe one of the other things we need to set up is also having some pearls associated with those artifacts. But yeah, once we see people like giving some more ideas on this and using it, then we can make sure that's set up. So any other things? Otherwise, I'll bring us down the list and maybe we'll just pick some discussion topics. So can we go back to maybe some of Ian's questions? Because these are really interesting and I think like quite new discussions. So maybe if you've got the chance, you can elaborate a little bit on the security issues. So like from my understanding, the problem is if like the URI expansion inside the bioregistry for an NCBI resource gets changed and then points to something malicious, maybe something that even looks like the NCBI site, this would be bad. And so you need to trust that the bioregistry is secure and this kind of change can't happen. Is this like the main concern here? Or maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, well, I'm passing on a bunch of concerns. So I put in the link to the document from a couple of years ago, and it starts out with a nice list of the FAQs. So I think these are the kind of questions that people were asking. I mean, to be honest, I have to admit, I usually address security as, yeah, that's an IT issue, and we rely on our IT departments to keep us all safe. But we have to, they have to understand the data and the risks that we're talking about. So we have to keep them informed about that. And, if you ask me what the issues are, I'm going to be said, well, it's what he or she said, which is what is essentially in that document. It addresses, for example, I think the one you were just referring to, could an attacker create a spoof satellite resolver, pretends to be authoritative, but actually returns manipulated information? And that question at the time was dealt with. I think this was Manuel from identifiers.org. They run a load balancer.
Yeah. So by the way, like maybe a really good example of this security vulnerability that you're talking about is anybody who's using prefix CC, which is like a really interesting resource because it's very easy for anybody to annotate it, but it's got tons of vandalism within it. People put links to explicit websites, not safe for work sort of things. And so that getting pulled into your content would not be a very trustworthy thing. So if you've noticed in a couple of places, the bioregistry said there's 24 and some places 25 registries that it keeps information about. It doesn't import or touch anything from prefix CC specifically because of this. So yeah, that's a totally reasonable thing. And then maybe, I already mentioned this briefly in the email, like it's possible to deploy like subsets of the bioregistry with custom things inside it. So that might be a potential thing that we can follow up on.
Yeah, it's particularly acute, I think, for us because as a US government resource, there a couple of things. One is you get vulnerable to attack. There was an incident. It's a different service, but the NCBI DNS was essentially taken down by a denial of service attack about a month ago. It happens from time to time. The stats we get from our security guys, they are under continual threat. I'm sure everyone has some version of this. So we do need to take it seriously. To my mind, when we addressed this discussion from 2 years ago, the issues were successfully addressed, but I will still encounter people who are not informed about all of the details or because of their job, they're going to tend to take a fairly conservative position, risk-averse position. And, one encounters I think we want to advocate the use of the kind of services you're talking about. But in advocating them within NIH, I would encounter, we can't rely on a third party kind of thing. So, and yeah, maybe the answer is, we run our own version of it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think
how we do all that, I think there's a lot of reassurance and good information that people need to have about the risks.
Yeah, this is great. I think that we can definitely come to some good situation with that. Maybe we should take a total 180-degree turn in this discussion though.
Yep.
One thing which I haven't had a lot of chances to chat with Michelle before is like the general future of registries, not just bioregistry, but prefix commons, which is now sort of morphed into, forgive me if I get the name wrong. I think it's I'm sorry, I forget the name of the name of it. I think it's the Bio2KG registry, right? and so identifiers.org and name to thing. And so these are kind of the big names for meta resolvers right now. And then there's all these other resources that do similar things, that have interesting information about identifier resources that are helpful to complement these. But what's the future of all these curation efforts? For example, I'm not sure if anyone from identifiers.org is on the line right now. Is there anybody? Maybe you can speak up really quick. Yeah, so this is actually a pretty good thing to show. It's been very difficult to chat with the identifiers.org people in the last couple of years. I think like a lot of EBI programs, there's this sort of drying up funding in terms of curation efforts. There's aging infrastructure and not a lot of goodwill. A lot of it's based on very, like, I want to say unsexy Java, which people aren't really that interested to improve and to maintain these days. And maybe it's a little bit of a bias from my side, but I'm not a huge fan of maintaining things in Java these days. Yeah, so what do we do? Like, one of the things that we want to think is, how do we consolidate curation efforts? Bioregistry imports a lot of prefix comments. It doesn't import everything because it seems a little bit scary to say, all right, we're going to just bulk import the last 450 things without really carefully talking about all of them. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rambling now. Like, maybe one of these other considerations is a lot of the resources that are inside prefix comments point to things that are not existing anymore. And I think this is great. It's really important to keep this information. But on the other hand, if you weren't the one who curated it, it requires a lot of context to really know what's going on with a resource that doesn't exist anymore. And
yeah, so interesting to that, like, I actually started to go through the list of my registry entries and curate their status as to whether they're alive or not. And I even used the Wayback Machine to try to find the last known alive version of the website and what it purported to be about and that sort of thing. So I've been doing that, but I only got through, I don't know, but 100 or 200 out of the 1,800, 2,000 entries we have. It's going to take a little bit of time. But I think that's also helpful metadata, right? About the status, what is this resource and that sort of thing. But that will take some curation effort. So I'm not sure about which, and I think this was the other thing with prefix commons. It started out as a joint effort, and then I think there was a diversion, it kind of split into two projects. So it's not really clear to me the relationship even between the Bio2KG registry and prefix commons anymore. So
yeah, personally, I consider prefix commons this Google spreadsheet, which you're the primary.
Oh, okay, yeah. But it's not the only thing, because
communication is very complicated and hard to understand for outsiders.
The group from Monarch, curated the prefixes they wanted in the Curie expansion document, the JSON-LB part. So there is other stuff and different interfaces. So that's why we sort of said, well, we'll walk away and just have something that we can control ourselves, just as they're doing, I think. But it would be good indeed that once we can do a proper mapping, then one of the things I might suggest is, if you do this importation of these other prefixes, there should be sufficient metadata for you, but perhaps you can kind of have a curation status if you don't already have one. And then you kind of indicate that this is unverified or something like that, so that people could choose a subset that maybe has been more recently manually assessed. And that would be one way to retain those older ones that perhaps indeed are not in use anymore. But like I said, we see them in the data that we process, right? That's part of the reason the registry exists.
Yeah, this is great. Maybe I can share very quickly something that might be helpful. Inside the bioregistry, we kind of got this thing called the health report going on, which maybe you can do something similar for prefix comments, or eventually when we bulk import everything from prefix comments, then you'll get this for free. This is something that runs on CI once a week, and it just goes through and it checks all of the URI format strings, and it tries to make URLs. So it checks the home pages, and then it checks the resolution for everything. And then it kind of gives a list of stuff that's failing, stuff that's passing, kind of what the error was that it got, or if it got a nice HTTP 200.
Yeah, that's good. Just realize also, in my manual curation, I also uncovered that, of course, websites changed, right? The template URL provided has changed than the original published one, so they still exist. It's just our documentation of it doesn't. So this is really good to keep status about okay, it's no longer, that address that we're using is no longer up, but is the resource no longer up? And that's actually that's a different statement, right?
Yeah, and this requires a lot of curation effort. So maybe one day we're always fighting websites going down. In fact, the number of websites that are down that are in this resource, it's very, very high. It's like, so that's kind of disappointing, but you know, not unexpected, since people.
This is the nature of the web, right? I mean, it's always been like this.
Does anyone want to jump in and talk about the value of pearls now?
But that's not sufficient, right? So like, even if they were all assigned pearls, that wouldn't change the fact that the resolver for the pearls is no longer available. Mm-hmm. And so it points to a bigger problem, which is that we are unable to replicate a website that was previously available. None of us can reconstitute and put online a resource that somebody has previously put up. And I think, you know, for resilience of our infrastructure, we should start to have these discussions, right? That websites are Docker deployable, right? It's open source. It's in a Docker hub and allows other people to redeploy the web application that serves up the content along with the content itself, right? That's a bigger discussion beyond what we're talking about. But
yeah, that's great.
So we're doing that. We have a cost action on distributed knowledge graphs, and that's one of the subjects of our working groups, is really how can we redeploy somebody else's web application, right? And we're trying to build sort of a community and community guidelines to help us do that, so that it's not just comes down to one group with one server to potentially host a web application, but it could persist to other users. And then it would make sense to have these persistent identifiers simply be redirected to either a round robin or to another dedicated host, or that we could bring them up as we need them, right? So you pull out your credit card with Amazon or Azure or whatever, and boom, you can rehost the data site that you want to access. But I think we're very far away from that right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me kind of again divert to a different discussion. I want to ask a question for everybody, and especially people who aren't super familiar with bioregistry so far. What kind of training materials would be useful that don't exist already, if you've kind of looked for something and weren't sure if bioregistry did it, or you know, even more generally, different kind of software in the related ecosystem. So whether this is resources from the master's group or some of the Monarch things that are related, like what kind of training materials do people think we should be spending time writing?
I mean, I want to ask a question about this in relation. It's kind of part of the what, but it's also the who do we need to be educating about this, because the initiative, so Tim Clark's dropped off now, I think, but and I don't think anyone else is on who was part of this initiative that resulted in, I can find a link for the paper, but it came out of the Force 11 data citation implementation pilot, which we at NIH had funded because it was important. And a big part of the people who needed to be educated were the submitters of data, and just about how to cite their data, how to, I mean, and I think it's not just a question of citing it in the text of a paper, it's how you make references within the data sets that you're publishing else as well. And so there certainly seems to be a need to educate anyone who's submitting data as to what identifiers to use and what best practices are. I mean, there's still a current within NIH that thinks, yeah, DOIs is the solution to this. And okay, maybe DOIs have solved things for certain kind of objects and people are extrapolating that to applying to everything. But I think seeing that kind of current, I think there needs to be a lot of education of it. And I'm sorry, that's more about the who than the what.
Yeah. So that's a very difficult group of people to reach, especially if you're not in the position of like being a funder or being a publishing agency.
Well, just to note, I mean, one of the key parts of that, say, data citation implementation pilot was to have a publishers subgroup. And one of the things that came out of that was a second paper, and certainly an editorial in Nature Scientific Data, which was, Susanna Sansoni was part of the initiative. So Susanna is the editor-in-chief of Nature Scientific Data. So that connection allowed it to be, but reaching that audience was there was a foot in the door there that maybe we can continue to exploit.
Yeah, I don't think there's any fair sharing people on the line right now, are there? So that's a whole different discussion of how sort of these kinds of things are complementary to what's in fair sharing. Okay.
Can I also add just to the training discussion? So one thing that is always becoming clear whenever any kind of standardization effort is promoted is that there are like usually 50 to 100 people that will actually use the tool for ETL reconciliation and this kind of things. But what is really like the mass of the people, what they really need is basic education. So if we go out there, for example, to promote standards for sharing mappings or standards for representing Curie prefixes and stuff like that, I think that what people need to really hear is what do we lose when we don't do this? This is really independent of bioregistry as an infrastructure. Like most people really need to hear about standardization of identifier schemes, standardization of representation, and then as a second line. And here we provide some infrastructure on how you can solve this. But yeah, most people actually that you talk to, they're not even aware of the cost they are incurring by randomly, like what I see all the time, for example, people putting, let's say, a column in their data, calling it OMIM, for example, and then putting the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ID in the table column. So basically, all of this stuff just causes downstream users 150 times to figure out, is this identifier, what the resources it relate to? How do I prefix it? What do I put in front of it and stuff like that? And I'm sure that this is happening all over the world 100,000 times. And I think basic education is really what we need to promote as like the bioregistry community when we go out there.
That's good feedback, since I know you've really gone through this process of thinking about educating people in this sort of sphere, especially with like the Obo Foundry and the Obo Academy.
Yeah, as someone who is not really from this area, but who has like the scientific background, I didn't need much convincing that it was valuable. And I also didn't need extensive educational materials about how to use it, because I found it to be quite straightforward, even though I'm not from the ontological community. So I think really what Nico said about making the problems more prominent and convincing people that this is something useful is, I guess, from an educational standpoint, more important than dealing with like higher level questions.
I mean, just to pile on with that and what Nico is saying, this should be something really simple that you learn once in grad school and then do for the rest of your life. And I thought we were getting to something with that simple, where people were going to ask me that question. I would say, well, you have to know the prefix and the local identifier. That's it. But if we got to things that have made that complicated and not more complicated than that, then I think we need to simplify it so we've got something that can be. So, the difficulty of education is like how complicated we make this in the first place. And it seems that there's some overcomplication to it that if we can get rid of, it makes the education task simpler.
So one thing that I've been thinking about lately in terms of the breadth of the ontologies that are on BioRegister, or even on something like Obo Foundry, is that there are kind of these other isolated rich ecosystems out there of data and resources that don't really seem to be participating in these efforts like at all. Like in some areas of like environmental biology, you know, every so often I'll just find a prefix that, you know, just doesn't show up anywhere else, but it seems like it could readily be integrated with other resources very easily. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit of that area. So are there other areas where it seems like we're kind of like scraping the surface of the people that might be interested in these kind of efforts? Because I think there's certain areas that are really well covered, like your usual kind of NCBI kind of biomolecular omics sphere, but I think there's a lot more kind of environmental chemistry and environmental biologists out there that that could benefit from, yeah, kind of even just kind of like a connection with some of these basic ideas.
Taxonomy people too. This is like underrepresented, and Adrian isn't on the line right now, but he participated in some curation, and he said, look, there's all this taxonomy stuff we care about. None of it's in bioregistry. Can I start adding stuff? And he was the first guy who was someone who showed up and said, I want more things in bioregistry, added a bunch of them. And we said, yeah, you're a co-author on the paper now. This is great. So if we can find other domains like that, I totally agree, Harry. This is awesome. Not easy to find these domains though.
Yeah, it's gotten kind of like a known unknowns kind of situation.
All right, so we got 10 minutes left, and I think we've had a lot of really nice bits of discussion. So maybe we want to sum up, or maybe some people have some other things they want to get in before we finish up.
Maybe a quick question about the practical application of what we talked about with the user profiles, or how you want to call it. Like, is there something existing in bioregistry that does that at the moment, and how?
Yeah, this thing that Nico showed about creating kind of a user profile for, like, if this is what you mean, for saying I've got some of my own.
I mean, more practically, how do you implement this?
It's all JSON configurations. So, okay, Nico just put another link to it. So the idea is there's
the page. Well, maybe this could be something for the education. There's
a link to the documentation on how to do this. Obviously, we've only done it once and we did it together, so maybe we didn't figure out how to educate people really well on it. But if this is like something you're interested in doing, then we can hold your hand to work through it, and then try and make the documentation better wherever it didn't make sense to you for the next person. Because I really would like to see more people writing these contacts up and then doing this rather than starting their own registries where they are changing 2 or 3 prefixes.
Can you tell me where the link to the documentation is, or maybe that should be more prominent on this page?
Nico just put it into the Zoom.
It's not on the page. What do you mean?
It's in the Zoom chat.
No, it is. There says
there's a link to like these rules and instructions on this web page that he links to, and that goes to this like long documentation explaining what's inside this and how to do it. But maybe it's still not enough.
Maybe I'm being dense. I don't know which link you are talking about now.
In the chat on Zoom right now.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Like /context.
Yep. Okay, well, while you're checking that out, I think Michelle wanted to say something, so maybe he can jump in.
Yeah, no, so I'm happy to move over to bioregistry for doing the primary curation, but I think we should sit down and have a bilateral meeting and just ensure that all the fields that we're curating, you can show me that are available, and then we can discuss the process by which we can like just fully move over to curating there. So we might end up hosting our own, so we have our own services around that if we have differences, but I'd still rather have all centralized curation. So we should discuss that specifically first.
That's really cool. I wasn't thinking that would actually be an outcome of our discussions. I don't think that it's fair to tell people you can't curate your own stuff, because
no, but I think, as long as there's central curation that satisfies the multitude of use cases that you're hearing here, then it makes sense, right? Then we're not recurating the same resources, because it's very costly to do this. So I don't mind. But we should just sit down and really closely examine this so that we can do that.
Yeah, great. I think you and I have a short email thread already. We can follow up on that and maybe try and pick a time before the winter break. Otherwise, we do it first thing in the new year.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Great. And then Ian, your hand's up too.
Yeah, I wanted to suggest that we can see if we can find a way to do some kind of presentation about some element of this within NIH as part of the presentations that the Office of Data Sharing Strategy organizes. They recently had a presentation on DOIs, and I felt that, you know, it would be good if people appreciated that there's more to this than simply DOIs. And I could work with you on how to do that. I mean, like I said, Tim Clark was on before and Julie McMurray was on, and I want to make them part of it because they were part of that previously funded effort that was, you know, working with the predecessor of Susan Gregorick's office to to raise this at the right level within NIH.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up. We'll do that. Okay, Luca has got his hand up. Ciao, Luca.
Oh, just wanted to mention a use case that you've listed in the docs. Just when bioregistry can actually uniform the CURIEs of many graphs in libraries such as Great Array that I've developed during my PhD. May I share the screen briefly? Yes.
Sorry, one more time. Oh yeah, go ahead.
It makes possible to just combine graphs, even larger ones, just by processing the nodes by enabling the processing using the bioregistry. And then simply one can combine them by just using a simple pipe. So you can combine, for instance, here it's the PubMed graph, the PubMed citation graph, and IDG, KJIDG, which is a graph developed by Harry. And since KJIDG has once normalized the many CURIEs that are perfectly compatible with PubMeds, one can just create ginormous graphs such as this one. And that's just beautiful and becomes possible when actually standards are followed. So let's hope for this brave new world where one can just do a pipe and that's all the one needs to combine graphs.
Yeah, anyone who's using graphs should be using graphs that Luca implemented. They're really, really nice pieces of software on the Grape side and small and big. And
by the way, if someone needs a PubMed graph, I'll be publishing it this evening.
Yeah, before we finish, Luca, can you please put a link to some of this stuff in the
Sure. My bad.
The others, people found that very interesting. All right, so we've got 2 minutes left, and I do want to end on time. So maybe to finish up, this was a really great discussion. It was really interesting to see some use cases where the bioregistry, with kind of like its original intended use case to help deal with resources like knowledge graphs, and this is great to see that people are able to incorporate it. It sounds like maybe we didn't have a lot of chat about like alternate registries, but I'm pretty happy that people are seeing bioregistry as like a nice integrative use case. And yeah, the ideas of like, how do we make sure that people with slightly different interests, you know, more semantic web, more RDF kind of interests, how are they supported? We're going to have to think a little bit about that and maybe make improvements to the data model, maybe do new kinds of curation, but I think those are like conceivable. And then thinking about how do we educate people, and this isn't just a job for the bioregistry, this is like our whole community, and thinking about, I mean, these four letters, FAIR, like this is kind of an easy way to put an umbrella around all of that and get people from all different places to start thinking about how to make data that's more useful for us. Anything I missed? Any other big stuff to summarize? Then otherwise, it's kind of a good time to wrap up. So thank you all for attending. It was really great chatting with you. Let's keep in touch. There's the kind of this hashtag prefixes channel on the Obo Foundry Slack if you want to chat about bioregistry and some of this stuff specifically. I think that's probably the best way to stay in touch.
Thank you, Charlie. That was great. Thank you very much for organizing it.
Yeah,
Thanks, Charlie.
See you all.
Thank you.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.